All right, today we're going to dive deep into a text that's thousands of years old, the 6th chapter of Leviticus. Now, I know it might sound like just some ancient legal code, but it's actually a fascinating window into a worldview where the spiritual and the physical were, well, completely intertwined.
But before we get into all the details about sacrifices and rituals, let's start with a question that I think we can all relate to. When you've actually wronged someone, maybe through a lie or theft or just a broken promise, what does it really take to make things right again? Turns out, this ancient text has a surprisingly practical answer.
So here's our game plan. We're going to look at 4 key ideas from Leviticus 6. We'll kick things off with how they handled sins between people. Then we'll zoom in on the daily duties of the priests. After that, we'll check out the super specific rules for their sacred meals. And finally, we'll tackle this wild idea of contagious holiness.
First up, restitution. So we're talking about situations where you lie to a neighbor or you find something they lost and you just keep it. This wasn't seen as just an issue between you and God. No, it was like a tear in the fabric of the community, and it had to be repaired. The way they did this was through something called the Trespass offering. And you gotta understand, this was so much more than just saying, I'm sorry. It was a concrete, step-by-step plan to achieve total restoration.
And here's the thing that's so important. The order of operations is absolutely key. Before you could even think about getting right with God through a sacrifice, you had to get right with the person you hurt. First, you admit what you did. Then, you give back exactly what you took. But it didn't even stop there.
The law demanded that you add a 5th part, which is 20%. This wasn't just some administrative fee. It was a serious penalty designed to make the victim completely whole again, for their loss, for their trouble, for the broken trust. Only after all of that was done could you finally bring your sacrifice to the altar. And this really gets to the heart of it all, the ultimate goal, atonement. In this way of thinking, you just couldn't separate your relationship with God from your relationships with other people. True atonement meant fixing both, bringing the whole community back into balance. Okay, so now let's shift gears. We're moving from the everyday person to the very center of their worship, the altar. And of course, the priests who served there. Their duties were nonstop, incredibly detailed, and absolutely vital. You know, at the core of all their responsibilities was this one powerful command. The fire on the altar was this constant burning symbol of God's presence and the people's worship. It could never, ever go out. That meant a priest was on duty all day and all night, every single day. And every single morning began with this exact ritual. The priest would put on special linen clothes, right? Clothes that were only for this holy task. He'd carefully remove the ashes from the day before, put them next to the altar. Then he had to change out of his holy garments into different clothes just to carry the ashes to a specific clean place outside the camp. Every little step was deliberate. Now, all this sacred work came with sacred provisions. The priests were actually sustained by parts of the offerings the people brought. But as you can probably guess by now, there were some very strict rules about how this food was to be handled.
And just so you can see where this all comes from, this isn't just word-of-mouth tradition. These are specific, written laws laid out right here in the text of Leviticus, detailing every single aspect of how this system worked.
So check out this distinction, because it's really interesting. A standard meat offering from the people, the male priests, so Aaron and his sons, could eat that. But look at the contrast. If a priest made an offering for himself, it was seen as too holy to be eaten by anyone. Nope, not even him. It had to be completely burned on the altar, a total offering to God.
And location was everything. The food the priests were allowed to eat couldn't just be packed up and taken home for dinner. It had to be eaten right there, in the court of the tabernacle. The act of eating was itself a part of the sacred ritual, and it had to happen in that holy space.
This brings us to our final section, and honestly, it might be the most mind-bending of all. The text describes holiness not just as a spiritual idea, but as a tangible force, something that could literally be transferred from one thing to another through physical contact.
This is the core principle right here. The meat from the most holy sin offering was so charged with this sanctity that anything it touched also became holy. For example, if some of its blood spattered onto a priest's clothes, that garment had to be washed inside the holy place. It's almost like holiness was a physical property that could rub off.
And this idea had very real consequences. If the holy meat was cooked in a clay pot, which is porous, that pot would absorb the holiness. It could never be used for a normal purpose again, so it had to be broken. But a bronze pot, which is non-porous, could be scrubbed clean and reused. The physical makeup of the pot itself mattered immensely. But there was one final, crucial line, a boundary that determined what was simply too sacred to be consumed, even by the priests. There was a level of sanctity that was completely off limits to humans.
Here's the rule from verse 30. If the blood from a sin offering was used for the highest level of atonement, meaning it was physically brought inside the holy tabernacle, then the meat from that animal was considered too holy to be eaten. It couldn't be food. It had to be completely consumed by the fire on the altar, given entirely back to God.
So we'll end with this thought. This chapter gives us a peek into a world with a totally different kind of sacred physics. What does it mean for holiness to be so tangible that it can be passed by touch, soaked up by clay, and scrubbed off of bronze? It really challenges us to think about where we draw the line between the sacred and the everyday in our own world.